Hey, what's up guys? Thanks for tuning in to this tutorial. Today we're going to look at creating this realistic Earth inside of Maya. The end result will be something similar to this. This is just straight out of Maya. There's no post-editing whatsoever. You can do some more realistic looks once you put it into Photoshop or whatever by putting the stars in the background and everything else. But this is the end product here. You can take a look. It's really high quality. You zoom in, you can see um, nice breaking up of the glaciers there. There's lights over here on the dark side of the planet and clouds and textures and everything. Looks really good. Anyway, this is kind of the idea of what we're going to be making. We're going to be creating everything through render layers. So you can see here we have our Earth selected right here. As we go up, we have our city lights now. We have a layer just for the clouds. And then a couple different atmospheres here. So this tutorial is an intermediate tutorial, so you should know, quite a bit of things about Maya. You should be pretty comfortable with going around the interface. But with that in mind, we'll go ahead and get started. So let's go ahead and open up a new scene, and I'll just say don't save. I have my grid hidden right now, but I'll go ahead and turn that on just so I can have pretty much exactly what you guys will be looking at. So something like this with a new scene. Let's go ahead and start by creating a polygon sphere. If you just click right here, polygon sphere will appear, and I typically just, when I'm modeling, I have the interactive creation turned off. So if you go to polygon primitives down here, interactive creation, turn that off. That way you don't have to scale it up by yourself, and you just click the button and it pops one out for you. So over here in our channel box, we'll go down here to our polysphere options, radius at about 20. And then my subdivisions, I'll turn these up to 60, somewhere around there, just a little bit more so we have a nice smooth mesh. Okay, so like I said before, we're going to be working in render layers, so we're going to have multiple layers over here. I'm in the render tab here, so by default you're in display. We'll go over to render. You see we have our master layer here, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a bunch of different layers and we'll start from there. So I'm going to have my sphere selected, and I'm going to just hit Control D, and that duplicates it. Okay, so I want to duplicate this. Let's see here. I want to do it 5 times. So let's go ahead and just go up to 5. And we're going to start naming these now. So I'll go over to Attribute Editor. I'll start out. We have our Earth with our Geo, Earth Geo. It's the first one. Second one is the city lights, Geo. The third one we're going to be using is the clouds. Fourth one will be our atmosphere, Geo. And the fifth one is another atmosphere. And you'll see why we do that here in just a second. So, well, we have 2 atmospheres. All right, and let's go ahead and make this atmosphere 1 so we don't get confused here. So we have 5 spheres here. All of them are the same, and all of them are in the same scene. So what we're going to do is we're going to go one by one. We'll go ahead and select the Earth Geo, open up our channel box here, and we're going to create some new render layers. Okay, so we're going to we'll have this selected, but we also want to have the same light source in each one of the render shots. So we're going to create a light right now. Because we hit 7 on the keyboard, there's no lights. We'll go ahead and create a light. So go to Create Lights, and we'll do a directional light. And then we'll just scale it up. When you're scaling directional lights, it doesn't really affect the intensity or anything. So just scale it up so we can see it. There it is. And just rotate a little bit, something like that. I don't know. And then that way we can have our light selected for each one of our spheres. So now we can go ahead and select our Earth Geo. We're going to Control Select our directional light, and then we're going to say create new layer and assign selected objects to that layer. So it's the very last one over here, this option. So now we have this layer selected. We're going to rename this our Earth Render. And we're going to go through and do this for each one. So city lights, we'll go ahead and Control select the direct light. rename this city lights render. We'll have our cloud selected. Control select directional lights, new layer, clouds render. And that one I messed up because we got to do a atmosphere as well as the directional light. And one more. Or what did I say? Yeah, atmosphere 1 render. So now what we should see is if I select the Earth mesh, it's not actually highlighted in here because that's not being displayed. The only one that's being displayed is the atmosphere 1 mesh because that's the render layer we have selected. If, however, I go down here and click on Earth render, you can see it changes and I have my mesh now selected. If I go back to, say, clouds render, and now I go over here in the outliner and click on clouds, that mesh will be selected. So it's kind of hard to see right now because all of them are the exact same size and the exact same position. But as we change through the rendered layers, we're also changing through the different meshes. So we're pretty much all set up, ready to go, and we can start texturing. And we're going to want to start with the Earth render layer. So we are going to assign a new material to this layer. We'll go ahead and right-click, go down to Assign New Material, and we are going to pick this anastrophic material right here. So this is the shiniest one that we make on Maya as far as the basic shaders go. So we'll go ahead and assign one of those to this sphere here for our Earth geo. And now we can start making some adjustments. And I'm going to say this several times through this tutorial. Every computer is different. Everybody's interface is different. So just because I use a certain settings on my my model here and my textures doesn't mean that it's going to look good on yours. So play around with it. I'll try to do my best in explaining what each setting we're changing does so you get an idea. But play around with it and see which one looks good for yours. Okay, so we'll go ahead and start with our specular shading because we can see it real nice here. So we'll scroll down here under specular shading and we'll make some adjustments to our angle. I'm going to turn our angle down just a little bit, maybe right around 9. Our spread Y, I'll go ahead and bump up to maybe somewhere around 4. Something like that. And then our roughness, I will take the roughness up to, let's say, about 0.8. And I'll also change our Fresnel index, and I'll bring that up just a touch, almost about 7. And we'll go ahead and go through what all of these settings do. And it's pretty easy to see just by looking at the mesh here. If you keep an eye on this shininess portion right here, you can see that if I change my spread X, what's happening, how far does it spread in the X-axis, right? Spread Y, same thing. How much far does it spread in the Y-axis? Roughness, you know, how far does it expand? Fresnel index is kind of like how shiny is it in that one area. This is real basic explanations of what's going on, but you can get an idea of what is happening here. So we will go ahead and continue on. Let's go back up here to the color settings and we'll assign our texture. So in the color, choose the option box here. We'll assign a file, and the file node we're going to be assigning is, let's see, let me get here. Where are we at? Okay. Under textures, now these textures will come with the project files. Download the project files and get all these textures. Makes it a lot easier. And we're going to do our Earth land. So you can see here we have our Earth land. Now these are very high quality textures, and that's what gives you that high quality render at the very end. So it might bog down your computer just a little bit. If you have a decent computer, it's not going to be a problem, but just keep that in mind. Once you start putting on all these different textures, you're going to be noticing a difference. So we have that assigned. We can hit 5 or 6, and you can see that it's assigned there. Here's our Earth, and we have the texture assigned. And let's see, we already messed around with our specular settings here. Let's go ahead and assign some other different files to it. So let's scroll down, and under our specular color, we're We're going to assign another file, and we're going to do Earth Specular. So here you have our Earth Specular, and we'll open that up. And right away you're going to notice that is assigned to it. And wherever that specular is at, you'll see that our specular shader is being applied to it. As I rotate this, the specular shader is displaying what is on our texture file. So pretty cool stuff. We'll mess around with some of these settings a little bit later. Let's go ahead and make sure there's certain things that are set up for your setup right now. So we'll go to the rendering and shading. You want to make sure under your shading tab that hardware texturing is turned on. That might not be turned on in your setup, so make sure that's turned on. Check that. Also for our color file here, the filter type, we can just turn that off. We don't need a filter type for that. And let's see, that should be good. And let's go back, make sure everything is set up the way we want it. It's good to get in the habit of naming your textures, just so whenever you go in and do some post-editing, it doesn't get confusing. You don't know which one you're changing stuff on. So we'll go ahead and rename this from Anisotropic 1 to Earth Shader. And then now we know that's our Earth Shader. So, all right, we're well on our way. Let's go ahead and continue editing, and we can make some fine adjustments later. Let's go down here to the bump mapping section. Open our option box. Again, assign a file to it. And let's go ahead and go to our image name, and we'll assign Earth Bump. And here we go. We have our bump map selected. Now right away you can see it's been applied, and it does look like we have way too high of bump settings. So we're going to adjust that right away. Let's go ahead and turn this down to a value of 0.3 might actually be pretty good. I'm going to do 0.2. Let's see how that looks. Let me change my render settings here. Under mental ray, I'm going to be rendering this in mental ray. And, well, actually, let's do my software, because some people might not have their mental ray. I'm going to check just the normal settings here. Okay, so I want to make sure that we're at a lower rendering setting for now, as we just keep doing several renders. And then at the very end, when we're ready for our final render, we can bump it up. Let's take a look at what we got. So again, it might take a little bit of time to render out depending on the computer specs because of how high of textures and stuff we're using. Alright, so let me also make another change here. By default, you shouldn't have this on. This is a setting we're going to turn on at the very end. But we're going to go here to the options and scroll down. Render all layers is selected right now. We want to turn that off while we're doing this editing, so it only renders the layer we have selected. So we'll turn that off, hit render. Now it should just render our Earth. We'll take a look here. Alright, so here we go. We can see our Earth. It's very bumpy still. We might be able to turn that down a little bit. Also the light, if we look at hit 7, the light is maybe not powerful enough. We can make some changes there a little bit later if we want to, but we definitely want to change this bump map. So we'll go ahead and take that down quite a bit. Let's do 0.05. 0.05. Let's see what that looks like. Render this out here real quick. Hey, that looks a little bit better. Again, we'll go ahead and continue fine-tuning these adjustments throughout the tutorial. So that's just a good start for now. Also, I think our specular over here is a little bit too hot. I'm not sure if I like the angle of it. Not sure if I like position of it and the color of it and everything. But we can, again, change that later. So, so far so good though. So we'll go up here to Window, go to Rendering Editor, and go to Hypershade. Pulls up our Hypershade here. Type in the search bar. We'll do Remap, and then it should pull up HSVC. We'll click on that. But let's go ahead and highlight our Earth shader, right-click on it, and say Graph Network. So now we can see what is going on here, what we have assigned to it so far. And if we hit our Remap HVC, we'll bring it out here. I'm just clicking and dragging out there. And or you can just click it and it'll pull one up. So here we go. Let's go ahead and zoom in here. See what we have selected here. So as of right now, we have two different file nodes, and we haven't named either one. And actually, we have three different file nodes. One is for the bump, one is for our regular texture, and one is for the specular. So you can see which one is for which by selecting the shader, going to Attribute Editor, and let's go ahead and look at our specular shading. And again, this is why you need to get in the habit of naming your stuff. Right now it just says file 2. So if I name that spec, now we can see, okay, this is the specular one right here. So we'll go ahead and select the specular, and we're going to shift and then use the middle mouse button. So hold shift, use the middle mouse button, and drag that to our Remap HSV. So we will select it, shift, middle mouse button, drag it over, and it pulls up this option connection editor here. And what we want to do is we want to connect the file's texture out color. So the out color is right down here. We want to connect that to the color channel of the Remap HSVC, which is right here. So we're connecting the output of our specular into the color channel of the Remap. And then we'll hit close. And now what we need to do is we have our specular going into our Remap. Now we need to make our Remap go into our Earth shader. So we will, this time instead of holding shift and middle mouse dragging down to Earth shader, what we will do is we'll go over here and we'll go to our Earth shader settings, and under the specular color, what we're going to do is we're going to shift select, or just middle mouse button select our Remap and drag that over to specular color. So we'll hit the middle mouse button, drag over to specular color. You see it highlights it there, select it, and now we're all lined up and we're good to go. So we can see here we have our 2D texture, goes into our specular settings, into our Remap, and down into our Earth shader. And that is how we take care of that problem. So now if we go ahead and render this out, so you can see here we have our bump detail still intact, and the specular is working at the same time. That's why we did this whole remapping thing, because beforehand, if we just assign a specular, it gets rid of the bump mapping. So now we have bump mapping working and specular working, and we're in good shape. So let's go ahead and move on. Let's go ahead and make some changes to our remap real quick. Let's see here, we go to specular settings, and under the remap settings, you can see we have this value thing here. Let's go ahead and change the value of what this looks like. So I'm just going to make a little change on the graph network we have here. Make a new point. I'll bring this one down just a little bit. So we want to just be slightly above the last one. I'll bring this one up. It looks like it's in a pretty good spot. And then I'll bring the end one down. I'm just kind of doing a quick correction here. It's kind of like a color correction, if you're familiar with that inside of Photoshop or After Effects or anything. And we'll go ahead and render this out and see what it looks like. So that looks a little bit better, I think. You might not be able to notice a difference. Again, our bump mapping might be it's a little bit too high. And again, we can change some of those settings a little bit later. So let's go ahead and move on and go to the next section. We're going to start talking about our city lights, but let me do this before I forget about it. Let's go back to the bump mapping settings, and we'll lower this down to say a value of 0.03. Render that out. There we go. That's looking quite a bit better, I think. So we got some nice specular, we got a bump map detail, and we're good to go. Move on. So we'll click the city lights geo. We'll go ahead and go to our city lights render layer, and now you can see a difference whenever we change from the earth render layer to the city lights render layer. You can tell we're totally looking at a different option here. And we'll go ahead and start working on this one. Our earth geo is in a good spot. So let's right click, go to assign new material, and let's assign a Lambert material to this. So let's go down here to Lambert, and let's rename this Lambert to City Lights Shader. We're going to take the material color here, we're going to take this all the way down to black, And let's go ahead and plug in the city lights texture. And we're going to plug this, instead of doing this into the color options, we're going to do this into the incandescence channel. And you're going to see why later on, why we do this. So we will hit the option box here, go to File, open up our city lights texture, and we can see it being applied to here. And by default, the texture will be in the same position as the previous Earth geo. That's something that's kind of important. So if I go back to our editor here and I go to Earth render, you can see where Africa is at and where the India and Egypt and all those places are at. If I go back to our city lights render, they're in the same spot. If you have, in the process of creating all these, rotated one of your Earths or scaled it differently or moved it somehow, these two are going to be off, and you don't want that. So like, let's say I rotate this a little bit, and now Africa's kind of facing the right-hand side, and I go back to Earth. It's not going to rotate that one because these are two totally separate meshes. So you want these to be in the exact same alignment because whenever you render it out, they need to match up. Otherwise, it's going to look very weird. So just leave the settings the same on the rotation and everything. And an easy way to do this is by selecting your mesh and looking at what the settings are here in the channel box, and make sure they just match up. Right now, it's all zeroed out. Same thing here. It's all zeroed out. So just make sure they match up. That way it frames up correctly. So the idea with the lights is that we only want it to show up whenever there is no light on the planet. So right now, as it's rendered, we can see here in our Earth layer, there's light on this side, there's no light over here, and that's where we want that city lights render to show up. So this can get kind of complicated, but we'll go ahead and give it a shot. So we'll go to our hypershader, and I'm going to clear this out here. Let's go to our city lights shader, graph this one out, and let's add something called a surf luminance. So you can see right here, surf luminance. I will drag that out here so we can see we have one of those. And what we're going to do is we're going to connect the surf luminance to a reverse node. So we'll type reverse into our search bar here, drag one of those out, and we're going to connect these two together. Let's go ahead and hit Shift, and then use the middle mouse button to drag the surf luminance node over to the reverse node, like so. And let's see, Shift while we do it to bring up the connection editor. And we're going to go to the out value, and we want to connect the out value to the reverse node's input X, Y, and Z. So the output of this surface illumination should be reversed in all directions, is what we're saying. And this is going to make sense here in just a little bit. So we have these two connected. And now what we want to do is we want to connect these to the city lights shader. I'm going to move these down here so we can see. So let's select our city lights shader, go to the attribute editor, and we're going to want to go to the color gain of our city lights shader attribute. So go on the file settings, go down to color balance, and now you can see we have some options. We have default color, color gain, color offset. We want to connect this reverse node to the color gain of our city lights shader. So we'll click the middle mouse button, drag it over to color gain, and now we can see it's connected to our file node here. And let's take a look at this and see what it looks like. I'll minimize this, render this out, and take a look. So you can see the light is shining on this side here, and it's all dark. But over here where the light's not shining, it is lit up, and that's exactly what we want. But it looks like the light right now is not quite powerful enough. It's letting a lot more, it's not cutting off as much darkness as we want to. It's letting more light in than we want. So what we can do is we can increase the light value, the intensity of this light. And let's go select the light, and right down here we see the intensity value set to 1. Let's bump that up to a value of 10. And if we render this out, see what it looks like. there we go. So you can see how big of a difference that makes. That light is really now casting the shadow on the earth here, and you can see it's cutting off to where we can only see the lights on this side over here. That's what we want. But let's go ahead and right click on the intensity settings, and we're going to go down to this create layer override option, and we have to make sure that is selected, and you can see now it turns orange. The reason why this is important is because if we don't do this, it's going to change the value of this light for every other rendered layer, and we don't want that. We want the other render layers to be set to a regular value of 1. So if we go back to our earth render, you can see here, oh, this intensity is set to 10. We don't want that. We want that to be at 1. So I'll bring that back down to 1. Let's check our clouds render. The light setting is set to 1. Everything else should be fine. And if we go back to our city lights render, under attribute editor, it's set to 10. So only this layer is affected. That's what we want. We don't want the light to be that bright in any other layer. And so far, we're on the right track. Now what we can do, since we have this city lights geo pretty much done, we can go ahead and go to our next section, which is the clouds. So we'll go down here to rendering layers, and we'll select the cloud rendering layer, select the clouds geo, and let's go ahead and assign a Lambert to this. So we'll go ahead and go to assign new material, and you can also, instead of doing assign new material, you can go down to assign favorite material. You'll have most of your ones right there, and then we'll just hit Lambert. We'll scroll over here to our Lambert. We'll rename this clouds shader, and we'll go up here to the color options, and we'll plug in a file node. And under the file node options, we'll open up our clouds file and let that load up for a second. And then what we want to do is we want to change the value of the colors here. So I want to render this out first, take a snapshot of this image, and then we'll come back to it so we can see what the difference looks like. So with it selected, let's go ahead and go down to the ambient color, and we'll mess around with the values here. I kind of already messed around with this and found a color I like. You guys can do whatever you want. Go ahead and in the H put 206. In your S options, I found that 0.320 was pretty good. And then in V, I did 0.112. So you're getting this little bit of a blue color, a slight blue. You can mess around with it a little more if you want it to be a little bit lighter, a little bit darker. But something like that I liked a lot. So if we render this out, you're going to see a difference here. Now we have more of this blue tint, whereas before it was really gray and it was just black and white. You know, so I think this one will give a little bit more depth to the image. You can see the difference there, and you can also see the clouds all the way around the entirety of the light as the light is shining over this direction. You can also see some over here on the dark side of the planet. So I think this looks pretty good. And really, that's all we got to do for our clouds layer. The clouds layer is very easy. So now we can start working on our atmosphere. And the atmosphere is arguably one of the most important parts of this entire thing, getting the atmosphere just right. So we'll spend some time on getting these ones right. So let's go ahead and select our atmosphere geo, and we'll go over to the atmosphere render now that we're done with the clouds. And we're going to assign a material to this, so right click, assign favorite material. Well, it's not in here. We'll go ahead and assign a new material. Anastrophic material is what we'll assign to this one. Let's rename this. I'll rename this to atmosphere shader. And let's give this color, again, I've already kind of messed around with the colors. I found one I like. Under our H, we'll put 195, which is kind of this bluish color you can see here. Our S is 0.7. You can see we have this bluish haze. And then under our V, 0.5 is not bad. I'm going to do 0.7 though, a little bit brighter. So something like this here, I think looks pretty good. Under our specular shading, if we scroll down here, I'm going to mess around with the angle settings and the spread here. So I'm going to turn my angle up to somewhere around in there, 12, 15, something like that. Spread X I'm going to bring down. So I'm going to really want this to be spaced out, maybe even down further, something like this here, right around 3.5 or so. And our spread Y I'm going to bring down as well, so maybe like a point or 2 point something. That looks pretty good right there, 2.5-ish. And our roughness, I'm going to bring this down as well, maybe somewhere around 0.5. Our Fresnel index, I will also bump up pretty much to the max value of 20. So I want this to be really shiny, but over a really spread out area. That's what we're doing. And these are the same settings we just messed with earlier on with our Earth Geo. So you kind of familiar with what these do and how they adjust the shininess of the object here. But we also want to change our specular color. Right now it's just a gray color. If I render this out, I'll go ahead and save this image. You can see what we got here. And let's go ahead and change our specular color to something that's a little bit more similar to what we have on our atmosphere. So I'll change this to a value of 194. And then let's change this to a value of 0.35. And then this one to a value of 0.25. So a little bit darker than our original color, but still in the same color spectrum is what we're going for. And if we render this out, you can see now it's just barely visible that we even have that there. It's not as harsh as our last one, but it's got a darker impact right where our other specular highlight is going to be. So this is just the settings I like. Again, as I stated earlier, and I'll keep saying it over and over again, every computer is different. Everyone's program's different for some reason. And what settings are good on mine might not look good on yours. So play around with them, see what you think looks good, and make yours look as good as you possibly can. So far we're doing pretty good on our atmosphere shader here. Let's go ahead and create a ramp node, because as of right now, if we render this out, you can see it's just a sphere with this solid color on it, and that's not what we want. We want this to be kind of transparent, but we need to make some adjustments to the transparency layer here. So let's go to the hyper shader, and we have our atmosphere shader here. Type in ramp, and of course we have the ramp shader settings that I popped up right here. Click on that, and what we want to do is we want to connect our ramp shader to the transparency portion of our atmosphere shader. So we'll middle mouse button, drag it over to transparency, and now we have that connected there. And you can see what that does is whenever I change the position of this color of the ramp node, it changes where the fall off and how transparent our atmosphere shader is. So that's going to come in handy. Also, what we want to do is we want to create a sampler info node. So we'll type that in, sampler info node. Got this one pulled out, and we want to shift middle mouse click and drag this up to the ramp shader here. So we will shift middle mouse button up to the ramp. Make sure we got this, shift middle mouse click up to the ramp to pull up our connection editor. And what we want to do is we want to connect the sampler info's facing ratio to the V chord here, and you'll see here in a second what this is actually doing. So we have this connected now to our ramp, and if you hit render, we'll notice something here. So if we render this out now that we see this, you'll notice that the atmosphere shader shows up even on the dark side of the Earth over here. So as we render this out, we want to see the atmosphere whenever the light is shining on it. However, whenever the light's not shining on it, on the dark side here, we don't want to see that atmosphere. And that's something we can fix right now. So we have our atmosphere node, and this is looking very good. We have our sampler node connected to the ramp, and a ramp going into our atmosphere shader. And we can fix this the same way we fixed the lighting problem on the city lights. So what we can do is we can create a surf luminance node, Type in surf luminance node, and I don't know where that went, but we'll drag that down to here. And we want to connect the surf luminance node to the color gain of our ramp node, similarly to what we did earlier on. So we'll go down, we'll have our ramp node selected, go down to color balance, middle mouse button and drag over to the color gain and select our out value and get that to the color gain RGB. Close that out, and this is gonna probably look pretty good. Let's do a test render real quick. Minimize this, and you can see now we have this transparency, and we have it to where now the on the dark side we don't have any of that the atmosphere showing. So it's looking pretty good. Let's go ahead and change a little bit more on this one. Well, actually, I'm pretty happy with the way this is turning out. This looks pretty good. I like the color. What we can do is, once we start doing some test renders of all of these rendered layers together, we can start making some more finer adjustments. But for now, I think this is actually looking pretty good. Let's go ahead and let's do our last render layer here. We'll select our atmosphere GO1. Let's go ahead and go down to our render 1 render layer, and we'll create a new shader for this atmosphere. The reason why we're doing this is because if we go back to our render settings, we see here, we do want this portion of the Earth to be darker, but we don't want it to be completely black. And even if we show a little bit of it, it's still going to have this nice blue tint that we want for the first part, but not for the second part. So we have a second atmosphere layer that will only show up in this section over here. That's going to be a different color, a darker color that we want. And so it still shows up, it still has a little bit of reflectivity, but not nearly as much as what's going to be on the first part. So that's why we have two atmosphere layers. But we have this one selected. We're going to apply a new material to it. We'll right click, go down to assign favorite material, and we'll assign a blend material to this one. Under the blend material attributes, we'll go ahead and rename this atmosphere 1 shader, and we'll make some adjustments. Let's go ahead and do something similar to what we did for the last one. We want to also assign a ramp material to the transparency portion of it. So we'll go down here to our atmosphere 1 shader, graph this one only, search for a ramp, we'll pull this one out, and we will zoom out here. With our atmosphere shader selected, middle mouse button, drag over to transparency, got that selected. Looks pretty good. So let's go ahead and look at our color settings here. Let's go ahead and bring the value of this down to maybe 0.0 something like that there. Looks pretty good. We want it to be kind of a darker color. Let's also look at our specular shading, and let's set this eccentricity to maybe a little bit more, value of 0.4. We'll have a little less roll off here. Don't want it to be so shiny. Bring that down quite a ways. And a specular color, want it to be very similar to our other one, so 0.0 something, 0.08, something like that. Reflectivity none, reflective color none. So let's take a look here. That looks pretty good. Not bad at all. We want this again to be on the dark side of it, and so we'll have to make some changes probably whenever we start rendering all of our layers together, which we can start doing now because we have all of our layers finished, and we can start messing around with some render settings. So let's go ahead and go into our render settings. We can go ahead and just do Maya software is fine. And we'll use a preset here. So under quality, we'll do our preset of contrast sensitive production. Will be our preset. And I think we just leave the settings the same here. Let's say that looks good. Looks good. Yeah, it looks good. We'll close out of this. We're going to go back to our render layer options. So under the options here, we're going to say render all layers. And this is going to take a little bit more time to render, and again I have it set to a lower quality just so we can see what this looks like for our test renders. So we'll go ahead and select that and see what this looks like rendered out. So it's going to render this out by each layer. So you're going to notice it's going to render out the first layer, which is going to be just the Earth geo. So here's our Earth. Then it's going to render out the second layer we have, which is our Earth lights. So you can see that portion over here. Then it's going to render out our clouds, and then it's going to render our atmosphere. So one thing I'm noticing that we forgot to do is set the transparency on all of these. So we want to check the render mode. Right now they're all set to normal. The only one we want to be normal is the Earth render. The rest of these we want to be set to screen. So all these are now screen, so they will render on top of one another. That's what we want. We don't want them to completely cover over one another. We want them to be rendered on top of one another. And the goal of this video is to render everything completely inside of Maya. So don't take it out to Photoshop, don't take it to After Effects, any of those programs. Just render it completely inside of Maya and see if we can't get a good look. So here we are. We can see what our final image looks like, and actually it looks pretty good. I'm pretty happy with the way everything's lining up. We can see we have our light is shining from this direction. Our city lights are on in the correct area. Right now it's a little different of a color, this blue color. Not so sure I like that much, but what we can do is we can do some color correction directly inside of Maya to make this look a lot better. I'll go ahead and save this here so we can take a look at this image after we make some changes. And let's see, let's start making some changes on this city lights geo here. What we can do is we can add something called a Remap HSV node, and we can fix some of those color issues on the dark side of the Earth. So we'll open up our render, or our Hypershed editor here. Let's go to our city lights and graph this network together. And what we're going to want to do is we're going to want to connect the Remap HSV node in between this file node and the city lights shader. So we'll go ahead and type in Remap HSV. This is going to be giving us all the color options that we can use to go ahead and color correct this right inside of Maya. So what we're going to do is we're going to want to delete this past connection that we already have connecting the file to the city shader. So we'll go ahead and delete that. And then we're going to connect the file node to the remap. We'll just do a default connection there. And we'll connect the out color to the color of our Remap HSV. Close this. We have these two connected. And then we'll go back and highlight our city lights shader, open up our attribute editor, and I'm going to connect this back into the incandescence portion of our city lights shader. So everything should be back to normal, except now we have these options here we have this hue option, saturation option, value option here, and we can make some changes to these. So let's start off with the hue. I want to bring this down quite a bit. I want to crunch the colors here. You can see real world updating here in the viewport. I want to bring this up something like this. This is going to match the color a little bit more to what our atmosphere looks like. So this looks pretty good actually. Maybe not crunching it that much. That might be too much, but crunching it down here. Something like that. Doesn't look too bad. Under saturation, we want to bring the saturation way down. So we'll come over here, we'll bring this down. Something like this. And maybe give it a little bump in the middle here so it's not quite so gray. That might be too much that we brought it down. Let's bring it up just a tad. Something like that looks pretty good. And the value here, we want to bring that down quite a bit, so we'll bring it down pretty steeply here. And maybe a little bump in the middle. Something like this, I think, looks pretty good. And again, we can do some test renders to see what this looks like. Let this render out here. And again, these are going to be the settings that really need to be fine-tuned for your specific image. Your image is going to look a little bit different. The value color is going to be one of the main things that you need to adjust. Is what does the value of that look like? You want it to be dark, but not too dark. See, this is probably a little bit too dark on the value side of things because I can't really see the lights as of right now. But what we can do also is we can rotate to a different section of the Earth here. Like I said, I'll rotate a little bit around to where maybe we're going to see some more lights, or maybe I'll rotate the light itself. So I can hit 7. See, we're lighting up this portion here. I can rotate the light itself. So we should be coming from behind the Earth now, and so now we'll have the whole side of Africa should be that dark portion with our city lights on it. Let's see what that looks like. Render this out here. So just this portion is lit up. You can see our city lights here, and not terrible. I'm going to adjust some of the value settings here. Maybe bump this value up a little bit so it's not quite so dark. And that looks a little bit better. I'm not going to do another test render. I think we can see the lights now. Well, I guess I'll do one more just so we can see what it looks like. But you can see how just using these options you can do a pretty rudimentary type of color correction inside of Maya directly, so you can just render straight from Maya without having to go to another program like Photoshop or whatever else, even though you do get way better control, way more control inside a program like Photoshop. So I do recommend doing that and getting used to doing that because it does look a lot better. But you can get some pretty good results from inside of Maya just by itself, as you can see here. This looks fairly good. Again, we're rendering at a really low quality. The image I showed you, I think I had the exact same render settings, except I did a 4K preset. And I'll show you what that is too here in a second. What you want to do is you want to find the right angle that you want to render at. So something that has quite a bit of light and then a little bit of the dark side of the Earth. And once you find that angle, you're going to render out in your high settings, your 4K settings, because you want to wait until you have the exact frame you want. That way you can do all the test renders you want to do. And maybe mess around with the light intensity settings here. It looks like the light intensity can be changed a little bit, maybe a little bit more on the bright side, maybe a little bit more intense with the spectral lighting there. But really, this looks pretty good. I think I'm pretty happy with the way this looks. One thing we can do too is to give it more of a realistic look, we can create a camera. So I'll just go to create cameras, just create a camera here, and panels perspective through that camera, zoom out here. We can mess around with the camera options. So under the camera attribute editor settings, I can change, let's change the camera scale to a value of 0.05. Let's change the focal length to a value of 110. And let's see, clip plane, near clip plane, let's do value of 1. Far clip plane looks fine. We'll zoom out here now. What we're doing is we're creating a camera that will give us a more realistic perspective of what the Earth would look like if we were actually out in space. You can see it's much larger now, and it's much harder to fit it all in one shot. So it's a much more realistic interpretation of what this Earth would look like if we were out in space. If we render this out, you can see what I'm talking about here. If you're out in space, unless you're really far away from the Earth, it's going to be hard to get the entire Earth in your camera shot because it's so large. So this gives us that perspective that looks a lot more realistic. So there we go. Got the large Earth in our shot. We have our different render layers coming on here, and so it looks really good. I'm really impressed with this. Again, if you want to render it out in a higher quality, I'll show you how to do that. Let's go ahead and exit out of here, or we can save this and you can take a look at the different once you change those HSVC settings, you can see, okay, so it was blue, it didn't look as good, and then now it looks much better, much more realistic. So in our render options here, again, you can just go down under the common settings. We're set to, our image size is set to HD 540. We can bump that up to a 4K square. So scroll down here, or scroll up, 4K square. There it is. It's going to take a long time to render out. I'm not going to do it right now. Well, maybe I'll just render it out and pause the video so you guys can see what the final image looks like. So I'll pause it real quick and come back to it. So here we go. Here's the final image rendered out at the 4K settings. You can see it looks a lot better once we turn the settings up. You can zoom in here. We got our bump. Maybe our bump detail now we can see is a little bit too pronounced, but we can go in and change that. Overall, I'm pretty happy with the way this turned out. Looks very good. And I hope you guys enjoy this tutorial and take a look at the other tutorials you got on the website. Thanks a lot, guys.